So let me introduce to you Garret. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at the California State University in Sacramento, USA, and he received a PhD from Rice University in 2008. Garret is currently working on a book called Neuromachian Ethics, in which he explores neuroethics from the perspective of virtue ethics. And Garret also pretty successfully entertains a YouTube channel filled with his lectures and talks, which has the very interesting title Sisyphus Redeemed. And today, Garret is going to talk to us about a topic which he titled A Conversation Between Two Graveyards, the Moral Responsibilities of the Artist in the Age of COVID-19. So, Garret, do you have a presentation for us?
My focus is on artists as philosophers rather than philosophers as theorists. And so in that spirit, I'm sort of going to engaging in a little more poetic flourish and a little less analytic rigor. I'm going to cite several artists, both in word and in image, but I don't necessarily mean to suggest that those artists would agree with everything that I'm saying in connection with them. I'm using them as stand-ins for the attitudes that I'm exploring rather than necessarily advocates for those attitudes. And then also, it's probably fair to disclose that I don't really have like any sort of straightforward thesis that I'm trying to argue for. I just have some concerns that I'm wanting to explore and put out there, and I hope you'll be willing to indulge me with that. And then lastly, the last disclaimer, my examples are very admittedly Americentric. I suspect that they will generalize to other countries, but if any of you want to tell me once I get to the end that you've had very different experiences in your homelands, I would be very fascinated to hear that. With those disclaimers out of the way, let me sort of dive into the heart of the matter. The question, what are the moral responsibilities of the artist, is an ancient one. It goes back at least as far as Plato and Aristotle. And I want to focus on two extreme answers to that question. The first is the idea that artists have no moral responsibilities at all. And the second is the idea that art is itself a form of moral responsibility. And these are the two graveyards of my title. And I call them graveyards not because I think the ideas are dead, but simply because I think most of the people who advocate for these two ideas are dead. So why don't we start off with one dead artist right here, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde says, "There's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." And in a second quote, he says, "The sphere of art and the sphere of ethics are absolutely distinct and separate." So Wilde is my first stand-in for the first graveyard, the idea that artists, their only responsibility as an artist is to, to their muse or to their creative vision or something like that. Now, they may have more responsibilities as people, as parents, as friends, or as citizens, but artists as artists, according to this first graveyard, have no particular moral responsibilities at all. And in fact, it might actually be counterproductive to try and impose moral obligations on art, because artists, by their very nature, are transgressive. And if you tell them, hey, you can't do that, then, well, they're probably going to try to do it. Now, that might seem kind of petty or even childish, but I think there really actually is something powerful about it. So the filmmaker David Cronenberg once said, "When I'm creating art, I have absolutely no social responsibility. It's like dreaming." And I think there's something really poetic in that a dream is very much emancipatory. And I think artists in general are emancipatory figures. They teach us that you don't have to accept the world the way it is. You can dream it anew. I have a quote here from John Keats, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that and go right to looking at some of the artists in my second graveyard. The first of which is James Baldwin, who says, "The role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see." I have a second quote from him here, but again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to leave it up rather than read it. So again, Baldwin is my first representative of the second graveyard. This is the idea that art is inherently social, inherently political, and hence can never escape a kind of moral context. Every work of art that an artist puts out into the world is going to have effects, and the artist has to take responsibility for those effects. My second representative of this second graveyard would be Jean-Paul Sartre, who says, it is to be hoped that all literature will become moral and problematic. Let it show simply that the artist is also a value and that the questions he raises are always moral. So on this way of thinking about things, I think it's a mistake to imagine the artist as some sort of singular genius from whom works of art just flow naturally. According to this second approach, art should be thought of rather as a product of very particular social conditions. Obviously, individual works of art are created by particular artists, but art as a social category is something that requires education, culture, patronage, support, and protection, and no single artist can produce those things all on their own. Social support enables art, and artists in turn have obligations to their societies that make their work possible in the first place. Now, again, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that artists have to slavishly abide by the commands of their society, but they do owe things to other people in virtue of their capacities as an artist. Okay, I have another quote here from the musician Tom Petty, but I'm going to skip that one too, again, in the interest of time. So if we were to sort of boil down the distinction here, I would say that the first graveyard says that art is fundamentally about individuality, and the second graveyard claims that art is fundamentally about community. Now that's all well and good, but it's also kind of old hat at this point. I think that's sort of the classic debate, and the question we're asking here is how things changed in the world that we live in today. About pretty much everyone that I listed there, I think the only exception being David Cronenberg, because he's the only one who's actually not dead, the only one who's still alive. All those artists lived in a world that is very, very different than the world in which we live today. Our world is in a strange paradoxical situation where we are simultaneously more connected and more divided. And that gives artists both potentially tremendous power and potentially tremendous responsibility. Artists can cross continents, they can bypass gatekeepers, and they can find an audience of millions, and they can do all of that without ever leaving their bedrooms. And since we're living in a time when communication, coordination, and trust both within and between nations is simultaneously so fragile and so desperately needed, art might be the only thing that can truly bring us together. So the mediums are changing and the politics are changing, but does COVID-19 actually change anything in this regard? I mean, after all, pandemics are nothing new. The Black Death, the 1918 influenza, the AIDS crisis, they all inspired art. And some of that art was socially constructive and some of it was socially destructive. Now, those plagues and the art that came out of them shows us that artists can tell us that we're in all of this together, or it can tell us that we're all on our own. Art can inspire solidarity and compassion in the face of pandemics, or it can encourage selfishness and sectarianism. And it's hard to say definitively whether or not it's a threat to artistic freedom to say that it ought to do the prior, that art ought to inspire solidarity and compassion. Is it a threat to artistic freedom if we denounce art that inspires selfishness and sectarianism? Does art have to be something that appeals to the better angels of our nature, or can it be something that debases us? To this end, I think it's instructive if we consider a single particular work of art in a little bit more detail. Edgar Allan Poe's short story from 1842, The Masque of the Red Death. You probably know it, but just in case you don't, brief synopsis. It's a story of a group of aristocrats who isolate themselves in a castle and have a grand ball while a plague is laying waste to the peasantry outside. Because these aristocrats believe themselves to be above their fellow human beings and removed from them, they allowed themselves to indulge selfishly in art and beauty. Direct quote here. There were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty. And it's something that, absent the plague, might seem quite glorious and quite wonderful. But in the context of the plague, it quickly turns terrifying because the revelry is broken when an uninvited guest, who we later learn is the plague made flesh, enters and reminds all of the guests and the reader alike that human boundaries are porous. Pathogens do not acknowledge class or nationality or individuality. We like to imagine ourselves as sovereign over our bodies, and that the boundaries of my flesh delineate a kingdom that are separated from your flesh by the ocean between us. But the trade routes that cross those oceans carry more than just poems and songs. They carry the Red Death, and they carry COVID-19. And in the end, as Cory Doctorow said in his reflections on Poe's story, human beings have a shared microbial destiny. So, well, that's a win for the idea of art as a form of social responsibility, right? Well, not so fast. These days, interestingly enough, staying locked up in our houses, isolated from the rest of humanity, is exactly what we're being told to do. The socially responsible way to consume art is actually precisely the thing that Poe seemed to be criticizing: staying at home alone and consuming art just for ourselves in a selfish capacity. It's the artists who are encouraging social consumption of art that are getting in trouble. Several musicians have held concerts and been hit with fines or public scrutiny for putting people in danger by bringing them out to listen to them create art. Christopher Nolan, the filmmaker, got in a lot of hot water over the summer because he was trying to encourage people to go see his new film Tenet in theaters. And as these headlines I'm showing here suggest, a lot of people were unhappy with that. And you can sort of see why, right? Because, I mean, on the one hand, it's incredibly dangerous, but on the other hand, people, myself included, we miss concert venues and theaters and art galleries. And while streaming services and social media concerts and virtual gallery walks are all well and good, but they can only fill the creative and emotional void to a certain degree. The actor Vin Diesel, early on in the pandemic, got in trouble when he said that we need movies now more than ever. And yeah, you could see that as selfish because he had a movie out at the time. But at the same time, I think he has a point. Do we really want art that just tells us to play it safe, that just tells us to conform? I mean, shouldn't art actually inspire courage? Shouldn't it get us to take risks, even potentially lethal risks? Because doing what we're told may keep us alive as human beings, but it's a death sentence for us as artists. And I mean that literally. According to one study, the United States might lose up to 1/3 of its museums. And this was in the middle of the summer when things were relatively better compared to how they are right now. Now, it's impossible to know for sure how the people of the future will look back on the art that we produce in this period and the decisions made by artists and their patrons. You know, some artists are leaning into the pandemic and trying to ground their art in the pandemic. The filmmaker Michael Bay made a film which apparently wasn't very good, but he's at least was making an effort to tell a story about COVID in the time of COVID. And then by contrast, there's other artists that are trying to transcend the pandemic, like the band of Flaming Lips, who held a concert, but they put everyone in their concert in bubbles so they could not spread the disease, at least in principle. If we go back to Tenet really quickly, we might imagine the first time that we go out to a movie. Maybe some of you have been out to movies, but I haven't been to one in over a year. And I keep thinking about the next time I go out to a movie. Is that going to be the time when I decide that I'm not going to be afraid anymore? Or is that going to be the last time when I can recall breathing without struggle? So, in closing, the real graveyards of the world have over 2 million new inhabitants since this pandemic began. And I want to be absolutely clear about something. Almost none of them are there because they chose art over safety. But some of them are. Some small portion of people are dead today because they chose art over safety. Now, I don't doubt for a moment that there is art in this world that is worth dying for. But I do have to wonder, for the few that have died and for the few more that will die before this is all over, for those people that died because they accepted the invitation of an artist, which graveyard would they choose for themselves? Thank you all very much.